There is a flight that departed Singapore on the 1st of October, 1972, that I keep coming back to when I think about what makes an airline genuinely extraordinary. It was Singapore Airlines flight SQ-108, a Boeing 707, 10 years old, pushing back from the gate at Paya Lebar Airport, bound for London Heathrow. The inaugural departure of a brand new national carrier that had existed for exactly 1 day, 10 aircraft inherited, a handful of international routes, and a mandate from Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew that was delivered at the company's inaugural dinner with characteristic bluntness. He told the assembled staff, "I set up Singapore Airlines to make profits. If you do not make a profit, I am going to close down the airline." No words of national pride, no celebration of Singapore's place in the world, just a commercial instruction delivered to an airline that had no margin for sentiment because it had no margin for anything. I think about that moment a lot, because Singapore Airlines, starting from that position, has become the most admired airline in the world. And the path it took to get there was shaped entirely by a constraint that looked, in 1972, like a crippling disadvantage. Singapore is 734 square kilometers, smaller than many cities. It has no hinterland, no domestic routes, no network of secondary airports connecting regional towns to a capital hub. When Malaysia-Singapore Airlines split into two carriers in 1972, Malaysia took the domestic routes and Singapore took the international ones. Malaysia got the captive market that every national airline uses as its financial foundation. Singapore got the routes where you compete against established carriers from 30 countries from day one with no protected revenue base to fall back on. Every other major airline in the world was built on the foundation of a domestic market. Pan Am had its Trans-Pacific monopolies. British Airways had its Heathrow dominance and its British passenger base. Lufthansa had Germany, Air France had France, Singapore Airlines had nothing equivalent. It had an airport, a small population that needed to travel internationally, and a government that would close it down if it did not perform. That constraint turned out to be the making of the airline, because it forced Singapore Airlines to make strategic decisions that airlines with domestic cushions never had to make. And those decisions, compounded over 50 years, produced something extraordinary. The first decision was about identity, and it was made immediately, before the airline had even established its routes. Singapore Airlines' first managing director, Lim Chin Beng, understood that an airline competing purely for international passengers against established European and American carriers could not win on network or frequency. Not at the beginning, not with 10 aircraft and 1 day of existence. It had to win on something else. His answer was product, specifically cabin service, and specifically in a way that no Western carrier could easily replicate because it was rooted in something authentically Asian that Western carriers did not have and could not buy. In 1972, they retained the Pierre Balmain designed sarong kebaya uniform that had been created for Malaysia-Singapore Airlines in 1968. The Singapore girl, the cabin crew identity that became inseparable from the brand, was not a marketing gimmick layered onto an existing airline. It was the strategic foundation of the airline's competitive positioning from the very first day of operation. Lim was explicit about the logic. Singapore's international passengers were not flying for Singapore, they were connecting through it, or flying on routes that happened to originate there. To attract them, Singapore Airlines had to offer something that made them choose SQ over BOAC, over Qantas, over Lufthansa. The answer was Asian hospitality executed at a level of consistency and refinement that Western carriers, with their unionized cabin crew structures and their culture of standardized minimum service, could not match. This sounds soft as a competitive strategy. It was actually brutally hard to sustain. Cabin crew recruitment and training at Singapore Airlines has always been extraordinarily selective. The ratio of applicants to accepted candidates has historically been in the range of 1 in 40 or 1 in 50. Training programs are long, demanding, and produce a consistency of service delivery across thousands of crew members that requires constant management attention and significant investment. The product strategy was expensive. For an airline with no domestic revenue to subsidize it, That expense had to be recovered entirely from international premium fares, which meant the product had to be good enough to command those fares against competition that was itself improving. They chose to stay ahead rather than defend a diminishing lead. And that choice, made implicitly in the early 1970s, became the central organizing principle of everything the airline did for the next 5 decades. The fleet strategy that followed from this principle is one of the most consistent in commercial aviation history. Singapore Airlines has always operated one of the youngest average fleet ages in the world. As of September 2025, the group's operating fleet of 208 passenger and freighter aircraft carried an average age of 7 years and 8 months. For an airline of this size, that is a remarkably young fleet. Most legacy carriers operate aircraft significantly older on average. The youth of the fleet is not a vanity metric. It is the physical expression of the product strategy. Newer aircraft have newer cabins. Newer cabins have newer seats, newer in-flight entertainment systems, newer lighting, newer galleys. An airline that operates aircraft for 15 or 20 years is an airline whose product is 15 or 20 years old by the end of its life, unless it undertakes expensive midlife refurbishment that negates the cost saving from operating older aircraft in the first place. Singapore Airlines resolved this dilemma by simply not keeping aircraft long enough for the product to age significantly. They retire aircraft earlier than almost any other carrier. They are consistently among the first customers for new aircraft types. The Boeing 747-400, the Airbus A380, the Boeing 787-10, the Airbus A350-900 ULR. Being a launch customer means taking delivery of the newest product before competitors have it, generating the marketing premium of being the first to offer passengers the newest cabin technology. It also means selling or leasing out aircraft before they reach the age at which maintenance costs begin rising steeply. Singapore Airlines operates on the steep part of the aircraft age cost curve and sells before it reaches the flat part. The aircraft they retire early still have significant value in the secondary market, partially offsetting the cost of replacement. This strategy requires capital discipline that most airlines cannot maintain. Continuously replacing aircraft is expensive. The only way it works commercially is if the premium fares the product commands are consistently sufficient to cover the cost of continuous fleet renewal. Singapore Airlines has maintained that discipline for 50 years. The product justifies the premium funds the renewal maintains the product. It is a virtuous cycle that is extremely hard to enter and extremely hard to disrupt once established. The hub that makes all of this possible is Changi Airport. And the relationship between Singapore Airlines and Changi is worth examining carefully, because it is not a conventional relationship between an airline and its home airport. Changi is consistently rated the world's best airport. It is not a coincidence that the world's most admired airline operates from the world's most admired airport. The two are strategically interdependent in ways that are easy to underestimate. Singapore as a city-state has made a national strategic commitment to aviation as economic infrastructure in a way that most countries have not. Changi's development has been prioritized, funded, and managed as a matter of national competitiveness rather than as a commercial real estate decision. The result is an airport that provides Singapore Airlines with a hub environment that is efficient, passenger-friendly, and operationally reliable to a degree that carriers based at Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, or JFK simply do not enjoy. Changi's operational efficiency, fast connections, clear signage, reliable ground handling, minimal delay directly supports Singapore Airlines' ability to charge premium fares on connecting routes. A passenger choosing between routing through Singapore and routing through a competing hub is choosing not just an airline, but an airport experience. Changi consistently wins that comparison, and Singapore Airlines collects the fare premium that results. And right now, in the weeks since the Gulf crisis erupted, that premium has never been more visible. With Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha either closed or operating at severely reduced capacity, travelers in Southeast Asia, Australia, and parts of North Asia who once routed via the Gulf are being rebooked through Singapore for onward connections to Frankfurt, Zurich, London, Paris, and other European cities. The geographic position that Singapore Airlines has built its network around, sitting at the midpoint between Europe and Asia on routes that do not require Gulf overflight, has become the most commercially valuable position in global aviation almost overnight. Industry analysts note that Singapore Airlines' ability to offer one-stop itineraries from Australia, Southeast Asia, and parts of East Asia to Europe via Changi, without relying on Middle Eastern hubs, is translating into a structural competitive advantage as travelers seek to avoid the most volatile parts of the region. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of 50 years of building a hub and a network that does not depend on any single geopolitical corridor to function. The dual brand strategy that Singapore Airlines operates today, their mainline and Scoot as its low-cost subsidiary, is the structural solution to a problem that every premium carrier eventually faces. As low-cost carriers expanded into Asian aviation through the 2000s, Singapore Airlines faced a choice that is familiar from European aviation. Do you compete directly with low-cost carriers by reducing your own fares and risk destroying the premium positioning that justifies everything else you do? Or do you ignore them and watch them capture the price-sensitive segments of your market? The answer Singapore Airlines arrived at is the same answer Lufthansa arrived at with Eurowings, and the same answer IAG arrived at with Vueling. You create a structurally separate low-cost carrier that competes in the price-sensitive segments under a different brand with a different cost structure, while the mainline carrier maintains its premium positioning completely intact. Scoot launched in 2012. It operates a fleet of Boeing 787 Dreamliners and Airbus A320 family aircraft on routes throughout Asia, Australia, and beyond. Its cost structure is genuinely low cost, higher seat density, unbundled fares, minimal complimentary service. It competes directly with AirAsia, Jetstar, and other Asian low-cost carriers on the routes where price sensitivity is highest. Critically, Scoot competes on routes that Singapore Airlines mainline either does not serve or serves at premium prices that a price-sensitive passenger would never pay. The two brands divide the market by passenger type rather than by route, which means they reinforce rather than cannibalize each other. The combined group carried a record 39.4 million passengers in the financial year ending March 2025. Singapore Airlines and Scoot together up 8.1% year on year. The dual brand architecture is working. The mainline premium brand captures the high yield passengers. Scoot captures the volume that mainline's pricing structure cannot accommodate. The group maximizes total revenue across both segments, without either brand compromising the other. The most significant recent strategic development at Singapore Airlines is its stake in Air India, and it represents the most ambitious long-term bet the airline has made since its founding. In November 2024, following the full integration of Vistara, the joint venture Singapore Airlines had operated with Tata Sons in India into Air India. Singapore Airlines emerged with a 25.1% stake in the enlarged Air India group. Air India, under Tata ownership since 2022, is undergoing one of the most ambitious airline transformations in recent history, ordering hundreds of new aircraft, rebuilding its product, restructuring its operations, attempting to convert one of aviation's most chronically dysfunctional carriers into a genuine global competitor. Singapore Airlines' stake gives it exposure to the world's fastest growing major aviation market. India's domestic aviation market is expanding at a pace that no other large economy matches. The middle class is growing, disposable incomes are rising, and air travel penetration is still relatively low compared to developed markets, which means the growth runway is long. The financial contribution of the Air India stake to the results has been challenging in the near term. Air India is still loss-making as it invests in transformation, and Singapore Airlines' share of those losses flowed through its accounts in the first half of its 2025 to 2026 financial year, contributing to a net profit decline of 68.7% compared to the same period last year, despite revenue rising to a first half record of $9.68 billion Singapore dollars. This short-term drag is the price of a long-term strategic position. India will be the world's third largest aviation market within this decade. Owning a quarter of the leading carrier in that market is a different kind of competitive advantage than Singapore Airlines has ever had before. Not the Changi hub advantage, not the product advantage, but a market presence advantage in a country where Singapore has no geographic claim and no cultural home. Whether it pays off depends on factors substantially outside Singapore Airlines' control. Air India's transformation is real, but incomplete. The June 2025 Air India crash added reputational complexity to an airline already carrying decades of damaged brand equity. The timeline for Air India to reach commercial maturity is measured in years, not quarters. But Singapore Airlines has always played a long game. An airline built by a city-state with no domestic market learns quickly that patience, discipline, and the willingness to invest ahead of returns are not optional qualities. They are survival requirements. As I write this, Singapore Airlines is navigating the most significant disruption to global aviation since the COVID pandemic. The airline had canceled 26 flights to and from the Middle East as of the first days of the crisis, with the affected routes including Singapore to Dubai, Singapore to Doha, and Singapore to Abu Dhabi, among SIA's highest yield long-haul routes. Those cancellations are real and painful for the airline's near-term revenue, but they tell only part of the story. The bigger picture is that the Gulf crisis has exposed, with brutal and sudden clarity, the structural advantage that Singapore's geographic position provides when the Gulf corridor becomes unavailable. For Asian carriers operating to Europe, the closure of Gulf airspace has forced longer flights and higher costs. But for those able to offer one-stop connectivity via Singapore, load factors and revenues on European routes are likely to increase as passengers who typically fly via the Gulf look for alternatives. Singapore Airlines entered 2026 with its largest post-pandemic schedule, planning more than 2,400 weekly passenger flights in March. The crisis has disrupted some of those flights. But the airline's network, its hub, and its product are exactly the alternative that the market is now actively searching for. That is not luck. It is 50 years of compounded strategic decisions, each one reinforcing the last. As of early 2026, Singapore Airlines is the world's most awarded airline. Named the world's best international airline by Travel and Leisure in 2025. Skytrax's world's best cabin crew in 2025. The only Singapore-based brand named in Fortune's list of the 50 most admired companies in the world for 2025. And the top-ranked airline among all industry competitors on that list. The fleet stands at 208 aircraft across the group, with an average age of under 8 years. The order book includes 31 Boeing 7779 aircraft, 7 Airbus A350 freighters, and dozens of additional narrow-body and wide-body deliveries that will keep the fleet young and the product competitive through the early 2030s. None of this was inevitable in 1972. An airline launched with 10 inherited aircraft, no domestic market, no guaranteed passenger base, and a prime minister who threatened to close it if it did not make money, had no obvious path to becoming the world's most admired carrier 50 years later. The path it found was built on 4 decisions made early and maintained consistently. Compete on product rather than price. Keep the fleet young enough that the product never ages. Build the hub relationship with Changi into a mutual competitive advantage. And never allow the premium brand to be compromised by the commercial pressure to serve passengers who will not pay for what it costs to deliver. Those decisions created the virtuous cycle that sustains Singapore Airlines today. Premium product commands premium fares. Premium fares fund fleet renewal. Fleet renewal maintains the premium product. In aviation, an industry that destroys capital with extraordinary efficiency and regularity, building and sustaining a virtuous cycle for 50 consecutive years is not just impressive. And right now, with the world's aviation system scrambling to reroute itself around a closed Gulf corridor, Singapore Airlines is exactly where its founders always designed it to be, at the center of everything. If you enjoyed this video and want to actually understand how aircraft work beyond surface level explanations, there's a great resource I recommend. It's called Flight Unveiled. It's a complete bundle that covers both pilot knowledge and aircraft engineering, from aerodynamics and systems to flight instruments, navigation, and real-world operations. Instead of piecing information together from different videos, it gives you a structured, deeper understanding of aviation in one place. You can click the link that appears now in the right upper corner or in the description below.